parts
Yeah,
we don't want.
I wish I did have it on some, but there's some you can buy with it on there. Okay, basically, what we're going to talk about here is, since I've got you right here, that I can talk to you about all kinds of questions about your life history, different thoughts on what really made you you. Okay, so we're going to start at the very
I
beginning.
thought you were going to ask about you 3 kids when you
Well, I
had
was.
Jennifer.
I was thinking about doing that, but I really
Well,
wanted to have you and Dad together, so I'll have to get the tape again. I can rent a videotape, so I can do that sometime when he's up more earlier. Okay, what do you think about that? What I thought we'd do first with you is do your life up to the point where you and Dad got married, and we'll do what your thoughts about after, maybe after us kids in the future. How's that? Is that
sounds
fine?
good.
Okay, sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay. What I'm going to talk about is I'll just bring up the topic, and you can talk as long as you want about anything. Okay. So, first thing I want to ask you about is your grandparents. Okay. This is a number one question, by the way. Okay. We're going to talk about
My
yeah,
grandparents.
your grandparents. What do you really remember most about them?
When I think of my grandparents, I think also where they lived.
Okay.
Grandma and Grandpa Schrock, that's my mother's parents, lived in LaGrange, Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it was a farm. And now, as an adult, I realize it wasn't in the country, it wasn't a big farm, but they had a small barn, and they had a couple of outbuildings where, during the time when I was very young, they had a great big old mother sow pig, with little piglets. They had large cages, or a series of cages where they had rabbits. They raised lots of rabbits. So they had, and when I was, maybe before I can remember, they had a cow, milk cow. So there were rabbits and pigs and cow, and there was this old barn, and you could climb up into the hayloft in that barn.
Mm-hmm.
And beside the barn was a huge garden, and it was next, and their home, and the garden was next to the railroad tracks.
Okay.
So the old steam engines came by, and we waved to the conductor, the engineer, and they waved back to us. So I remember the railroad, trains.
Did you live very far away from them?
We lived in Sturgis. And Sturgis was, I guess, around 10 miles.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was little, that was quite a trip. We'd go to Grandma's on Sunday, and when I was little, we'd often have a flat tire. It was during the war, and tires were rationed, meat was rationed, sugar was rationed in the Second World War. And you had to have stickers and stamps, and victory gardens, and all those things had to do with the war. But it made it, for us, a long trip. You had to know you had gas, and if you had a flat tire, it took a lot of time just to get it changed and get down there. You didn't drive fast. Of course, it took money for gas, and to have the time. So it would be Sundays, it seemed, as I remember. We'd eat dinner. We'd come back at night, and I remember, what I remember most was when I was old enough that Madeline, my sister, would have been a couple years old, so I must have been 6 or 7. And we'd both fall asleep in the back seat of the old car, and then we'd get carried in and put to bed. So going to Grandma's was making a trip,
Mm-hmm.
even though it was only 10 miles. And if it was cold weather, we had to be all bundled up because the car didn't get warm. And sometimes the car didn't start. So you had a lot of mechanical problems with the car. So going to Grandma and Grandpa Schrock's was making a trip. And it was also, LaGrange was also a very, very small town, a rural town, where the farmers came in. Every weekend the farmers came into town. It was the courthouse. It was the county seat with a big courthouse. And the Amish and their horse and buggies. So it was sort of a neat place, a different place. It had a country flavor to it. Sturgis, where I lived, and where my dad was born and raised, and where Grandma and Grandpa Kuhan lived,
Mm-hmm.
was a factory town.
Okay.
It had factories, and so that even though it was a small town, it had a different flavor altogether than LaGrange, Indiana.
Okay.
LaGrange was right next to the northern part of Indiana, and Sturgis was the southern, right at the next to the state line
Oh.
of Michigan, southern Michigan. And Grandma and Grandpa Kuhan had a big 2-story house, and they also had a barn. And in that barn was some of the shelving, cupboards, and an old soda fountain that came out of Grandpa's Green Parrot bar. As I remember it, that's where it came from. And in fact, it had the old soda fountain pumps on it, and we'd play out in the barn. It also, both houses, both Grandma and Grandpa Schrock's and Grandma and Grandpa Kuhan's, had second stories with attics. You could walk into, it'd be like another bedroom, but it was the attic. Storage area and unfinished walls, but it had stuff in it. It was intriguing, kind of fun, mystery kind of places. The other thought about Grandma and Grandpa Kuhan is that they had a cottage at the lake. So we'd stay. When I was little, your grandma and Grandpa, my mom and dad, Kuhan lived with Grandma and Grandpa Kuhan. So the three generations were in the same house. So when I was very, very small, and then again when I was a little older for a while, I stayed a lot with Grandma Kuhan. I used to walk over there for lunch because my school was not far from their house. And I could get in there. School wasn't far from my high school. Their house wasn't far from my high school. The cottage. One other thought, because we would go fishing. So when I think of Grandma and Grandpa Kuhan, I think of the fact that they always fished, and we ate fish. We had freshwater fish. Then it was Crotch Lake.
Okay.
Their cottage was on Crotch Lake, just like Aunt Jerry and Uncle Orville's was on Crotch Lake, just like Uncle Victor's and Isla's cottage was on Crotch Lake. That's the same lake where your Aunt Madeline, Uncle Bob now have their home, and it's called Omena Lake. So we grew up swimming at that lake and fishing on that lake.
Okay. Anything you want to say about your relationship? I mean, the way you perceived your grandma and grandpa in terms of, did you see any favoritism at all toward different kids?
Absolutely. My sense was, and even as an adult, I'm sure it's true, that I was Grandpa and Grandma Kuhan's favorite. Because I was the first, because I lived with them as a baby. When my mom and dad had me, they lived with Grandma and Grandpa Kuhan. So I was born, raised, started life in their home. And Grandma and Grandpa Kuhan had 4 sons. Their only daughter died in infancy. So I was their lost daughter. I was the first granddaughter. They had a grandson, but didn't live nearby. Chloe had a boy, and Victor had no children, and Orville had a son after another year or two after I was born. So I was the second grandchild, but the first granddaughter. So I know that I was spoiled by them. They, really their favorite. Now, Grandma and Grandpa Schrock's, there was another way in which I was kind of favored by Grandma. I think I was Grandpa Kuhan's favorite, but in Grandma Schrock's, I was the first grandchild born to her only daughter. She had 4 sons, 5 sons, and Grandma and your grandma, my mother. So I was her daughter's first baby. And I didn't live there, whereas some of the other granddaughters did. I don't know that I didn't think of her ever. I never thought of my being a favored one. But when I got older, Nancy and Margaret told me that.
Okay. How about, let's move on to your parents. What do you remember, what's your memories mostly about your parents? As far as I know that your mother's still alive right now, but what about how you thought of your father and how you thought of your mother, and how you thought they thought of you, and how how did you feel about them? I mean, how did they come across to you?
I can remember when I was in Girl Scouts being really proud of my mother. I had one of the youngest mothers as I was growing up, probably around 8 or 9 years old. I was aware that my mother was, um, she hadn't put on a lot of weight, and she was young, and some of the other mothers were much more dowdy and matronly and older somehow. And my mom read a lot, still does. My mother was a musician, so, and I was the firstborn. I think I had the privilege of hearing my mother play the organ and play the piano, and she accompanied other musicians. So when I was little, a violinist, a recorder, not a recorder, but a clarinet, I guess it was, but especially the violinist. I remember them coming to our house and mother accompanying them on the piano, and they practiced, and so there was nice music, good music, very good music. My father worked in a factory, mostly all at Harder's of parts, formed tubes, not Harder's, formed tubes. They bent tubes that were part of cars, making cars, car parts, And one period of time we lived in a little house across the street from the factory. So we lived in a poor section of town. We never had a really residential. We had a nice home later, but we lived in we had limited income, limited resources, and mother always made the best of that. And she was active in church organist. So, and she liked to read, and we went to the library and that kind of thing. Some good educational benefits. Mother was always proud of when I would get good grades. So I think she helped to motivate me to get an education. I'm sure, so she was very proud of my achievements. So that's part of why I went on to school. And I got my affirmations by good grades. And my dad and I always had difficulty. I just remember, seems to me I remember our being angry at one another most of our lives. And I'm not sure why.
Do you think it might have come from the fact that you were a daughter instead of a son and his firstborn?
Could be. Could be. I think part of it came because he was so young, and it was hard, and financially it was hard for them, and partly because I was sick a lot, as I remember being sick a lot. I was stubborn and strong-willed, and we just clashed. My sister came along 4 years after I was born, and she was healthier and more robust and could take teasing a lot more, and she and Daddy got along really well. So I remember that she was Daddy's favorite, and I remember that I was Mommy's favorite, and she did well at school, but she didn't, at least for a good number of years, didn't care about education as much, and she got along a lot better with Daddy than I did.
Well, how about your brother?
Well, Richard's so much younger than me that I didn't grow up with him. I remember, my sister and I, let's see, I was 12 years old when Richard was born, so I became a teenager and I didn't pay much attention to him. He was a nuisance. He was a little boy that I babysat with, and he was kind of a nuisance. And then by the time he started school, I was going off to college. Just about at least. He'd started school. And so when he was going through elementary school, so forth, I was going to college, and then I went to seminary, and then I remember the first couple things with Richard. Madeline and I cut his hair, and really did a terrible job. Mother came home and, what have you done to him? Cut his hair off. We were trying to be the barbers when we were very young. But then when he was 12, and I was 24 then, he flew his first time to be on an airplane. He flew to New York City. I was working in New York, not in New York City, I was working at the Hudson River in New Paltz. But he flew to New York City, and I went down and met him at the airport and took him home for a visit. He was only 12, and mother let him fly out to New York City. I just think that was, and we went sightseeing, Empire State Building, and Rockefeller Center, and all that. And then I took him home up to my home in New Paltz, and he stayed and visited, and we found a family. He had a good time. But that's probably not until he was about 12 years old did I spend much time with my brother. So we didn't grow up together.
Were you a planned baby, or did your parents get married because your mother was pregnant, or anything like that, or were you definitely planned, or just when they got married, all of a sudden you came along? Do you know? Do you remember?
I don't know. That's a strange question, Christopher. I mean, I'm surprised you asked it, because it was only probably a couple years ago when my dad died. I tried to talk with my mother a little bit about why Daddy and I always were at such odds when I was growing up. We got along, when they moved to Florida, we got along.
Do you think maybe
I think he didn't want to have a child as soon as I was born, and I think I was a strain on the marriage and a strain on him. And I also think that I was a lot like him in some ways, although maybe my temperament, maybe by being stubborn, and we just clashed a lot.
So, which parent do you think that you mostly had the most characteristics of?
Oh, my mother.
Okay.
No, I mean, I look like my mother, but I think I'm intellectually curious. My mother's always learning, reading, learning new stuff, and I'm the same way. I just have to read more, I find out more, I'm curious about things. It bugs people sometimes, but.
Do you remember anything more about your birth? I mean, your very early years. I mean, before anybody would have.
The stories I remember are the ones that I've been told. So that was another thing that I tried to talk to Mother about, in terms of why do you think I don't remember, and why do you think, I asked my mother, why do you think that what I remember seems to be sad? I remember being, I remember being unhappy, or being sad, or sad memories, it seems to me. There were, I think that my mother and dad had a lot of fights, and I don't remember happy Christmases. I mean, not that I remember unhappy Christmases especially, but it seems like I would remember. I don't remember birthdays, fun things. But I think some children are thoughtful, introspective, quiet kids. Other kids are just by birth, by disposition, more outgoing and carefree. And I think I have been a reflective, sensitive, oversensitive, even when I was very, very little. So I tended to be somewhat moody and sad. And my mother said her earliest memories are sad, tinged ones too. So I think I just don't remember much about being very, very little. Because some of it was tense.
Okay, but you don't remember any memories, basically, that nobody else seems to remember. That,
like the time that I got in the car when we lived on Orange Street. First block of Orange Street off Chicago Road in Sturgis, Michigan, is a steep hill, and I released the brake on the car and drove the car down. I was 2 or 3 years old, and started the car down towards Chicago Road, which is a highway. Of course, in those days it wouldn't have been the highway it is now, and fortunately ran it up on the curb before it went out into traffic. I don't remember that. I mean, I know that I did it because I've been told about it. I had a Shirley Temple doll. Vaguely remember having that doll and where we lived. I can't remember living before we moved to the Orange Street, where we lived in a couple on St. Joe Street. I don't remember that at all. I don't really remember living at Grandma's as an infant. I remember when we went back to Grandma's a few years later. don't have memories myself of that, what happened.
Do you think there's anything in your personality that is, what do I want to say, different or was influenced by you being the oldest in the family? You know,
Oh, sure.
compared to, let's say, if you were the youngest? Or do you think there's anything in
Well,
your emotional, mental, physical makeup because you were the oldest that would have been different than if you were the younger? Or
I'm not clear, except in my readings, there's a lot of correlation, great correlation of firstborns and achievers. Expectations for firstborns to do well in school, to go on to school, to whether that comes from primarily from the parents or whether it comes from something within, because I'm not clear. I know that I've read that firstborns have some of those expectations and some of those behaviors. I'm not real clear in my case why that's so. Mother spent time reading to me. Mother talked to me. You'd be interested in this. Madeline and I went to a conference in Grand Rapids on mothers and daughters, and part of the session during that day, we were asked by one of the leaders to write down what we knew. I'm not sure how she asked us. Write down about what we knew about our mother, the stories our mother had told us about herself, or what we knew about our mother. Well, I wrote, and Madeline just wrote a couple of bits, couple lines, and stopped. Madeline was second born, didn't have the input from mother about mother's childhood, mother's family, mother's life. Part of that might have been that I asked, because I'm curious. Part maybe that I observed, and I learned from my grandmother, and my cousins. Or it basically have been because I was firstborn, mother spent the time talking to me. And I knew lots more about our mother than my sister did, who has the same mother, who didn't know any of those things about my mother. That's part of what you're asking. Another thing that I would respond in terms of your questions. Both Grandpa Schrock and Grandpa Kuhan were heavy drinkers. In the Schrock family, all of the boys are heavy drinkers, and 2 of the boys died of alcoholism. That's very difficult for your mother, my mother, your grandmother, to talk about. I now understand that my dad was an alcoholic, not a heavy drinker he drank beer, but he was an alcoholic in the sense that it was a way of avoiding dealing with his dissatisfaction with life, his unsuccessfulness in work and finances and lack of accomplishment, and so he would drink just to, my sense is that it would numb and take away his perception of things. But it meant that he didn't interact with us. My mother raised us kids. My mother made the decisions. My dad was not a very active participant, except that he and I would have fights. And he would be cross and negative. He had a very negative attitude. I think he was unhappy.
Okay, let's take a look at the same question from, let's take the position of your sister or your brother. How do you think they felt about being
I think their perceptions would be entirely different. You see, Madeline and I talked a little bit about how she sees the family, and she sees mother and daddy differently. She had a different relationship with my dad, so she doesn't see him as being that unhappy. And she liked to cook, and she liked to work in the kitchen, and she got married as a teenager. She and Bob fell in love. She was only 16 years old when she married Bob. Yeah, her life was entirely different than mine. Entirely different.
Well, how about in terms of how your brother and sister look at you? I mean, I'm curious about the parents, but also how they viewed you.
I don't know.
You don't know. You never talked to your brothers or sister about that? Never asked them how they thought of you when you were growing up, or?
I know that at one point, Madeline and I we shared a room. You see, when we lived in 805 Prairie and 203 Wenzel. On Prairie Street, we lived across, and that was down in what they called Dogtown, poorest section of town, the poverty place area. A lot of poor kids and families. We shared a room, shared a bed, and fought a lot. We each wanted our own space and our own privacy. We didn't have it. When we moved to 203 Wenzel, we each got our own room, and I ignored her. I just ignored her completely. I was in high school, 8th, 9th grade, junior high, and then high school, and she was just a nuisance. We did a lot of roller skating. So when I got into high school, and she started, like I was a senior, and she started high school, I was more aware of her. She was a pretty girl. She had lots of friends, but we didn't have the same. We were never in the youth group in church together, as far as I can remember. I'm sure. My sense is that she probably was really glad when I went away to school, because I don't think I was a very friendly big sister. I've never asked her. We became friends after I got married and after you kids were born. I would like to know what she thought of me, but I never asked.
Might be a question to bring up. Now you jumped into this a little bit in that last question. How about school? What was your peer group, and how did you relate to other kids in your school grade years, school years? I mean.
Several things come to mind. Go ahead.
Okay. And one other thing, how did you feel about? Okay, you talked about that you came from a poor. You were a poor.
Financially or
Yes.
economically deprived.
Yeah, your financial rank in this scheme of things at school. Okay.
My friends had probably 3 circles. Where I lived in Dogtown, there were a bunch of kids, and I had a lot of friends there. They were, however, not kids that did well in school. So the kids I walked to and from school with were not the ones that I had as a peer group when it came, especially from 7th grade on, where we began to be separated by our performance. When I went to school in the elementary school, and one school just had 2 grades in, 5th and 6th grade, 4th and 5th grade in it, we were all in the same room. But when I started 6th grade, and then in the 7th grade, they began separating us 6A, 6B, 6C, 6D by I believe they did it by grades. I think we were separated by how academically. And I did exceptionally well, always. So I was always getting A's. So I had some very good teachers that I liked very much, and I tended to be a teacher's favorite. I got along well with teachers. There were several teachers in high school that really helped. I didn't have much self-confidence, and I wasn't in with the popular crowd socially, but I was academically. so the ones who did, and I can even, their names come to me, their faces and names come to me, they came from the family